December 14th, 1978. Norwalk Hospital, Connecticut. A 28-year-old man was dying. Cancer had destroyed his stomach, liver, and colon. His mother, Muriel Reutershan, held his hand. His fiancée, Laura Tasheko, stood by the bed. He tried to speak. The words came out in a whisper, but they were clear. "I died in Vietnam and didn't even know it." Paul Reutershan closed his eyes for the last time that winter afternoon, but his words didn't die with him. They would echo for decades. They would transform how America understood the real cost of war, and they would expose one of the greatest betrayals ever committed against American soldiers. This is the story of Agent Orange, not the story of the war, not the story of burned forests or destroyed villages. This is the story of the children who were born without arms, without legs, without a chance, the children who paid for their parents' war, and of the 30-year battle to make the government admit the truth that had been hidden in their own files from the beginning. Paul Reutershan wasn't a name you knew, not until 1978. He was from Stamford, Connecticut, son of Polish immigrants. Grew up like any American kid in the 60s. In 1967, at 17 years old, he enlisted in the Army. A year later, he was in Vietnam, helicopter crew chief, responsible for transporting supplies to the 20th Engineering Brigade. He flew almost every day through clouds, but they weren't rain clouds, they were chemical clouds. C-123 aircraft dumped herbicide over the jungle. Paul saw it from his open helicopter door. The forest turned brown, died in days. He flew through the fog, breathed it, felt it on his skin. The Army told him it was safe, relatively non-toxic to humans and animals. Those were the exact words, relatively non-toxic. The herbicide's name was Agent Orange, so called because of the orange stripes painted on the 200-liter barrels that contained it. Between 1962 and 1971, the United States dumped 77 million liters over Vietnam, 12 million gallons, an area equivalent to the entire state of Massachusetts covered with poison. The objective was simple: kill the trees, expose enemy soldiers, destroy the crops that fed them. But there was a problem. Agent Orange contained dioxin, specifically 2,3,7,8-TCDD, tetrachlorodibenzoparadioxin, the most toxic chemical ever created by man, and the companies that manufactured Agent Orange knew this since 1965. Paul Reutershan returned from Vietnam in 1969. He was 19 years old. He began having stomach problems, became nervous, irritable, developed severe chlorachin on his back, a skin condition that didn't respond to treatment. In 1977, 14 months before dying, he discovered he had stomach cancer. Paul had never smoked, never drank, ate simple food. He was what his friends called a health nut. At 27, with terminal cancer, he began asking questions and found answers he shouldn't have found. A woman named Maud DeVictor worked as a clerk at the Chicago 5A Veterans Administration. She processed disability benefit claims. In 1977, she began noticing a pattern. Young Vietnam veterans, all with rare cancers, all denied. She started doing her own research, collecting data that no one was officially collecting. She discovered something alarming. There was clear correlation between Agent Orange exposure and serious illnesses. DeVictor took her files to Bill Curtis, an investigative reporter at the CBS affiliate in Chicago. In March 1978, CBS broadcast a documentary, Agent Orange, Vietnam's Deadly Fog. Paul Reutershan watched and understood. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't bad luck. It was the herbicide. The clouds he had flown through hundreds of times were killing him from the inside. Paul contacted Edward Gorman, a Long Island attorney specializing in personal injury, asked him to file a lawsuit. In May 1978, Gorman filed a $10 million lawsuit against 3 Agent Orange manufacturers: Dow Chemical, Monsanto, Diamond Shamrock. Paul also founded an organization, Agent Orange Victims International, AOVI. In the following 6 months, as cancer consumed his body, Paul dedicated every moment to warning other veterans. He appeared on the Today Show on national television, told America, "I died in Vietnam, but didn't know it," spoke at events, collected testimonies, gathered veterans who were sick and didn't understand why. Before dying, Paul named his colleague Frank McCarthy to continue as AOVI director, made his family promise they would continue the fight. 4 days after his death, his sister Jane Jeezich spoke with reporters at the funeral. She wasn't crying, she was furious. "We will continue," she said. "My brother started something that won't stop just because he died." And it didn't stop. Paul's attorney, Edward Gorman, initially refused to transform the case into a class action, thought it too expensive. But Frank McCarthy and AOVI members sought another lawyer, Victor Iannacone, specialist in workers' compensation and cases involving toxic substances. On January 8, 1979, 25 days after Paul's death, Iannacone filed a class action lawsuit in the Southern District Court of New York in Manhattan. The definition of the aggrieved party was comprehensive. Any individual in present or future generations at risk from their own exposure or their parents' exposure to Agent Orange. This included not just veterans, it included their children, born and unborn. While Paul's lawsuit was being transformed into something larger, a story was happening elsewhere. A story that would prove even more devastating. A story about a child. Carrie Ryan was born in 1976. Her father had served in Vietnam, had been exposed to Agent Orange. When Carrie was born, doctors counted 23 distinct birth defects. 23. She had heart problems, limb deformities, malformed internal organs, conditions that no doctor could explain through family history or genetics. Carrie's parents applied for VA benefits, argued that their daughter's defects were the result of the father's Agent Orange exposure. The VA denied. There wasn't sufficient evidence, they said. There weren't conclusive studies. There was no legal basis. In 1984, the Ryan family filed their own lawsuit, Carrie Ryan versus Dow Chemical and other manufacturers. The case drew national attention. For the first time, a child was suing the chemical companies. Not the veteran, the child. The victim who had never set foot in Vietnam, who had never held a weapon, who was paying for what her father had breathed in a jungle on the other side of the world. Carrie's lawsuit was eventually consolidated with the larger Agent Orange case, but her argument was unique. She wasn't asking for compensation for cancer or illness developed after exposure. She was born with the consequences. Her DNA had been altered before her first breath. The chemical company's lawyers argued there was no proof of causal connection, that birth defects happened naturally, that it was impossible to prove Agent Orange from the father had specifically caused Carrie's problems. The United States government joined the argument. Expert witnesses from the Department of Defense testified there wasn't sufficient scientific evidence, but there was. It was just hidden. In 1965, scientists at Bionetics Research Laboratories conducted studies for the National Cancer Institute. They exposed pregnant rats to 2,4,5-T, one of the components of Agent Orange. The results were clear. High rates of birth defects in offspring, cleft palates, absent kidneys, severe deformities. The study was completed in 1965, but wasn't made public until 1969, 4 years later. 4 years during which the United States continued dumping millions of liters over Vietnam. 4 years during which Paul Reutershan flew through the clouds. The government knew. The chemical companies knew. Monsanto had conducted its own internal studies showing that dioxin caused birth defects in laboratory animals. These documents weren't disclosed until decades later. When files were declassified in 2009, the full extent of prior knowledge was revealed. The companies knew since 1965 they were producing something that damaged future generations. While individual cases like Carrie Ryan's fought in courts, the main class action lawsuit grew. More lawyers around the country added their clients. The number of represented veterans reached 250,000. More than 250,000 men claiming they had been poisoned by the very government they swore to defend. The judge presiding over the case was Jack Weinstein, Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York. On May 7, 1984, the eve before trial was to begin, Weinstein negotiated an out-of-court settlement. $180 million, the largest settlement in history up to that point. 7 chemical companies agreed: Dow Chemical, Monsanto, Diamond Shamrock, Hercules, Uniroyal, TH Agriculture and Nutrition Company, Thomson Chemical Company, all received immunity as military contractors. They didn't have to admit guilt, didn't have to admit they knew, simply paid and moved on.